Thank you very much. I'll start with a disclaimer. Someone, on being told I was from a royal, said, "Do you do the Queen's horoscopes?" And I had to say, she's never asked me, and I'm only a scientist anyway, and scientists are rather poor at forecasting, almost as bad as economists. But let me start off by showing this picture, sadly familiar in the last month, Notre Dame. Its builders knew of nothing beyond Europe. They thought there might be an apocalypse within a millennium. But they created an immense and glorious building, which they knew wouldn't be finished in their lifetime. In contrast, even though we're today mindful of immense horizons in space and time, our planning horizons span decades at most. But there is an explanation for this seeming paradox. Medieval people had lives that played out against a backdrop that changed slowly. They thought their children and grandchildren would lead similar lives. In contrast, we expect the lives of new generations to be unpredictably different from ours. And that's partly why we discount the future too much. It's why even those who accept that there's a significant risk of climate catastrophe a century hence don't necessarily advocate urgent action today. Those like the Copenhagen Consensus, who apply a standard discount rate, they write off what happens after 2050 and downplay their priority of addressing climate change compared to shorter-term efforts to help the world's poor. But if you care about those who live into the 22nd century and beyond, then, as other economists like Martin Weitzman argue, you deem it worth paying an insurance premium now to protect those generations against the worst-case scenarios. Well, there are one or two confident predictions. One is that the world's getting warmer. That's being discussed by other speakers. But another is that the world is getting more crowded. So a word about that. 50 years ago, world population was about 3.5 billion. It's now about 7.7 billion. And the growth's been mainly in Asia and Africa. This distorted map gives each country an area proportional to the growth in the last 30 years. But the number of births per year is going down in most countries. Nonetheless, world population is forecast to rise to about 9 billion by 2050. That's because most people in the developing world are young, they're yet to have children, and they live longer. The age histogram in the developing world, on the left, will become more like it is in Europe, on the right. Population pressures seem under-discussed. That's partly because doom-laden forecasts by Paul Ehrlich and the Club of Rome proved off the mark. As it's turned out, food production has kept pace with rising population. Famines still occur, but they're due to conflicts or maldistribution, not overall scarcity. But to feed 9 billion by mid-century will require further improved agriculture, low-till water conserving and GM crops, and maybe dietary innovations, converting insects, highly nutritious and rich in proteins, into palatable food, and making artificial meat and less real beef eating. To quote Gandhi, there's enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Demographics beyond 2050 are uncertain, and there are some experts in the audience here. It's not even clear whether there will be a global rise or fall. Urbanization, declining infant mortality, and women's education trigger the transition towards lower fertility, but there could be countervailing cultural influences. We don't know. In particular, if for whatever reason families in Africa remain large, then that continent's population could double again between 2050 and 2100 to 4 billion, thereby raising world population to 11 billion. Nigeria alone would then have a population as big as Europe and North America combined. Well, optimists say that every extra mouth brings two hands and a brain, but the potential geopolitical stresses of that are deeply worrying. As compared to the fatalism of the past, those in poor countries now know via internet, etc., what they're missing, and migration's easier. Moreover, the advent of robots and reshoring of manufacturing means they, in still poor countries, can't grow their economies by offering cheap skilled labour, as the Asian tigers did. It's a portent for disaffection and instability, multiple megaversions of the tragic boat people crossing the Mediterranean today. As implied in the last talk, wealthy nations, especially those in Europe, should urgently promote prosperity in Africa, and not just for altruistic reasons. And another thing, if humanity's collective impact on land use and climate pushes too hard, the resultant ecological shock could cause mass extinctions. We'd be destroying the book of life before we've read it. Already there's more biomass in chickens and turkeys than in all the world's wild birds. And the biomass in humans, cows and domestic animals is 20 times that in wild mammals. Biodiversity is a crucial component of human well-being. But for many environmentalists, preserving the richness of our biosphere has value in its own right, over and above what it means to us humans. To quote E.O. Wilson, mass extinction is the sin that future generations will least forgive us for. We should be evangelists for new technology. It's crucial for providing food, energy and health for an expanding and more demanding population. But we need wisely directed technology, and many of us are anxious that bio, cyber and AI are advancing so fast and unpredictably that we can't properly cope with them. So a few thoughts on these where we can't make predictions even 20 or 30 years ahead. Biotech offers huge prospects for enhanced health and food production, but of course it has some downsides. Some advances already raise ethical and prudential concerns. For instance, the 2011 experiments on gain of function in the flu virus, showing it was made more virulent and more transmissible, and the possibility of gene drive, where you make a species extinct. Okay for the mosquito that carries the Zika virus, but what about for the grey squirrel? Governments will surely adopt a stringent precautionary attitude, but I'd worry that whatever regulations were imposed on prudential or ethical grounds can't be enforced worldwide, any more than the drug laws can or the tax laws can. Whatever can be done will be done by someone somewhere. An atom bomb can't be built without large-scale special-purpose facilities. But biotech involves small-scale dual-use equipment. Indeed, biohacking is burgeoning even as a hobby. And the rising empowerment of tech-savvy groups, or even individuals, by bio as well as cyber technology will pose an intractable challenge to governments and aggravate the tension between freedom, privacy and security. The global village will have its village idiots, and they'll have a global range. These concerns are near term, within 10 or 15 years. But by mid-century, we might expect two things in biotech: a better understanding of the combination of genes that determine key characteristics of humans and animals, and the ability to synthesize genomes that match these features. And if it becomes possible to, as it were, play God on a kitchen table, our ecology and even our species may not long survive unscathed. And what about robots and AI? Everyone's probably heard about DeepMind's amazing computer that quickly became world-class, beating the Go world champion and playing chess, becoming world champion standard within a few hours by playing against itself thousands of times. And of course, it's the speed of computers which gives them such power and versatility. AI can cope with complex, fast-changing networks, traffic flows or electric grids. The Chinese could have an efficient planned economy that Marx could only dream of. And in science too, maybe machines can help us, for instance, to settle whether string theory can really describe our universe. But AI learns from large training sets. That's why it can't learn from watching humans, because it's like us watching trees. Everything happens so slowly by their standards. And that's why it's hard to ensure that they share human goals, and it also means that they will never replace jobs which require human-type empathy. But popular culture portrays a dark side, where AI gets out of its box, takes over the Internet of Things, and pursues goals that are misaligned to human interests. And some AI pundits, for instance Rodney Brooks, inventor of the Baxter robots, thinks it'll be a long time before artificial intelligence is a bigger worry than real stupidity. But others think the field already needs guidelines, just as biotech does. Robots are still clumsy. This one can do somersaults. But if they do become able to interact with the real world, will they truly be perceived as intelligent beings? Will we then have obligations towards them? Should we feel guilty if they're underemployed or bored? Ray Kurzweil is the author of a book called The Age of Spiritual Machines. There he is. He even thinks that humans could transcend biology by merging with computers. In old-style spiritualist parlance, they would go over to the other side. We then confront the classic philosophical question. If your brain were downloaded into a machine, in what sense would it still be you? Or is the input into our sense organs and physical interactions with the real external world so essential to our being that this transition will be not only abhorrent, but also impossible? These are old conundrums for philosophers, but practical ethicists may one day need to address them. But not even Kurzweil thinks this will happen in his lifetime. So he wants his body frozen until immortality is on offer, and he can then be resurrected into some post-human world. I was surprised to find that 3 academics back in England had gone in for this so-called cryonics. 2 had paid the full whack, 1 cut price for just his head being frozen. And I'm glad they were from Oxford, not from my university. Yeah. And I told them I'd rather end my days in an English churchyard than an American refrigerator. But of course, research on aging is being seriously prioritized. Some think it's a disease that can be cured. Dramatic life extension will plainly have huge ramifications for family structure, population projections, and indeed a fundamental new kind of inequality. Nonetheless, without going this far, it's certainly credible that human beings, their mentality and their physique, may become malleable through genetic and cyborg technologies. Moreover, this future evolution, a kind of second intelligent design, would take only centuries, in contrast to Darwinian evolution, which takes thousands of centuries. And this is a game changer. When we admire the literature and artifacts that have survived from antiquity, we feel an affinity across a time gulf of thousands of years with those ancient artists and their civilizations. But we can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonance with us, even though they may have an algorithmic understanding of how we behaved. A few words now about space technology, my special interest. This is where robots have the greatest potential future and can cause less trouble. Swarms of miniaturized probes will explore the planets. Robotic fabricators will assemble huge lightweight structures in space. But what about humans? It's nearly 50 years since Neil Armstrong made his one small step. And indeed, I had the privilege of lecturing here about 10 or 15 years ago, the day that Neil Armstrong was installed as a fellow at this academy, and he was there sitting in the front row when I was speaking. You couldn't have a bigger honor than that. He seemed to be paying attention. Yeah. Because of robotic advances, the practical case for sending people into space is being eroded. Were I an American, I would only support NASA's unmanned program. I hope manned flights will continue, but I hope private enterprise will take the adventurers prepared to accept higher risks than NASA can expose civilians to. So because they can take high risks, they should be fronted by the public sector, SpaceX and Blue Origin. There'll be many volunteers with the mentality of explorers or mountaineers. And by 2100, some thrill-seeking adventurers may have established bases on Mars. Elon Musk himself says he wants to die on Mars, but not on impact. Yeah. But don't expect mass emigration from the Earth. Nowhere in our solar system offers an environment even as clement as the Antarctic or the top of Everest. Here I disagree with Musk and with my late colleague Stephen Hawking. It's a dangerous delusion to think that space offers an escape from the Earth's problems. Dealing with climate change is a doddle compared to terraforming Mars. There's no planet B for ordinary risk-averse people. Nonetheless, we should cheer on the pioneer Martians with their frontier spirit, because they have a pivotal role in determining what happens in the 22nd and beyond. And this is why they'll be ill-adapted to their new habitat, so they have a more compelling incentive than us to redesign themselves. They'll eagerly harness whatever super-powerful genetic and cyborg technology becomes available. They'll be far beyond the clutches of the regulators, and we should surely wish them good luck in modifying their progeny to adapt to a hostile environment. And if they make the transition to fully inorganic intelligence, they won't need an atmosphere. They may prefer zero-G, and they'll be near immortal. So it's in deep space, not on Earth, nor even on Mars, that non-biological brains may develop powers that humans can't even imagine. But this raises the question that astronomers are always asked: is there life out there already? Or is a sterile cosmos awaiting our progeny? We don't know. We don't know how likely it is that life began elsewhere. We don't know how it began on Earth, and still less whether it's likely to evolve into anything intelligent. Maybe we'll one day find ET. On the other hand, Earth's intricate biosphere may be unique. But it's important that even that would not render life a cosmic sideshow. And that's because there's abundant time ahead for post-human life seeded from the Earth to pervade the galaxy. This is the familiar time chart, 4 billion years for Darwinian evolution. But the sun's less than halfway through its life, and the universe may continue forever. To quote Woody Allen, eternity is very long, especially towards the end. So we may be nearer the beginning than the end of the emergence of complexity. But even in this concertina time span, extending billions of years into the future as well as into the past, this century is special. It's the first in Earth's history when one species, ours, has the power to determine the fate of the entire biosphere for good or ill. So finally, let me return back closer to the here and now. We may be political pessimists, but we must surely proclaim that AI, biotech, sorry about this, getting out of order, AI, cyber and biotech, and space can boost the developing as well as the developed world. And my book, called On the Future, offers some tentative hopes, fears, and recipes. Technology offers huge promise, but Our society is brittle, interconnected, and vulnerable. Social media can spread panic and rumour literally at the speed of light. We're in denial about newly emerging threats that could be globally devastating. Some of these are environmental, the pressures of a growing and more demanding population, and climate change. Others are the potential downsides of novel technology. A wise mantra is that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. The trouble is that even the best politicians focus mainly on the urgent and the parochial, not on long-term global issues, nor on averting possible catastrophes that haven't yet happened. Unless enough voters endorse such policies. So concerned scientists must enhance their leverage by involvement with NGOs, via blogging and journalism, and enlisting charismatic individuals and the media to amplify their voice. If Carl Sagan was still alive, he'd be leading the march for science and electrifying the crowds with his passion and eloquence. Let me mention two recent instances. The papal encyclical Laudato Si had a worldwide influence in the lead-up to the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. There's no gainsaying the Church's global reach, long-term vision, and concern for the world's poor. And I doubt that we in the UK would be legislating against non-degradable plastic waste had it not been for the BBC's Blue Planet 2 programme, fronted by our secular Pope David Attenborough. Especially the pictures of albatrosses returning to their nests and regurgitating plastic debris, an iconic picture like the polar bear on the melting ice floe. And it's encouraging to witness more activists among the young, unsurprising as they can hope for living to the end of a century, and their commitment indeed gives ground to hope. So, spaceship Earth is hurtling through the void. Its passengers are anxious and fractious. Their life support system is vulnerable. But there's too little planning, too little horizon scanning, too little long-term vision. We need to think globally, we need to think rationally, we need to think long-term, empowered by 21st century science and technology, but guided by values that science alone can't provide. And I give the last word to one of my scientific heroes, the eloquent immunologist Peter Medawar. He said, I quote, "The bells that toll for mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They're attached to our own necks, and it must be our fault if they don't make a melodious and tuneful sound." Thank you very much.
Questions? Yes.
Richard Meserve from Falls Church. Thank you for a fascinating talk and your view of the future. I look forward to reading your book. We did hear earlier this morning about energy technologies and their significance in confronting this huge challenge of climate change. I wonder if you have any insights on the technologies that we might be applying to deal with, specifically with the energy challenge.
I'm diffident because there are bigger experts here, and we heard from them this morning. I mean, the one thing I would argue is that enhanced R&D into all forms of clean energy and into the other things we need, like better storage, is a win-win situation, because we want to ensure that countries like India, where they now depend on smoky stoves, burning wood and dung, can leapfrog directly to clean energy and not build coal-fired power stations. And they will do that if the cost of the clean energy comes down. So it's a win situation for them, and also a win for the countries with high-tech capabilities which develop these. And it'd be hard to think of a more inspiring goal for young scientists and engineers than to try to develop clean and affordable energy for the world. I don't have any more to say than that, but I think we should explore all the options.
Who has the mic? I think right behind you, Annie.
Oh.
That was a wonderful talk. Jim Baker from Washington, D.C. I read your book recently. It's a wonderful book, and I recommend it to everyone. And in the book, you mentioned the fact that Cuba
raised your hand.
has developed a 100-year plan for protecting itself against climate change. Maybe you could say a word about how you picked Cuba and why you think they have taken the lead in long-term planning.
Well, I think they're talking about adaptation rather than mitigation. And I think it's true that there's bigger incentive for any country to take that line. And I think Holland and other countries will do that. But I think the hard thing, of course, is to persuade politicians to spend money now for the benefit of people in remote parts of the world 50 years from now. That's the hard thing. Mitigation is harder to get funds for than adaptation, where the benefits are local, where you spend the money.
Thank you very much.